Le Nissan Kick-Play 2025 a beaucoup de plus. Apple CarPlay intégré pour jouer vos tunes préférées, des fonctions avancées de sécurité, un rendement énergétique remarquable, puis même la petite odeur de char neuf qu'on aime tant. Tout ça en plus pour moins. Le Nissan Kick Play 2025 est le véhicule neuf le plus abordable au Québec. Achetez-le à partir de seulement 22 774 $, incluant un rabais à l'achat comptant de 2 600 $. Profitez de cette offre avantageuse chez votre concessionnaire dès maintenant. Jusqu'au 2 mars, des conditions s'appliquent. Détails chez Nissan.
All right, welcome back to the Elias Macko Show. And we're going to begin the third hour of the program by talking about Starlink. Have you heard of Starlink? It's a satellite internet company. Of course, it's from the mind of Elon Musk, which I know one of the reasons why it gets a lot of attention. And there are questions as to whether or not Starlink is becoming too dominant. And I kid you not, I'm reading a story this morning in Journal de Montréal, and it was a delightful story. It was about a 29-year-old woman. And she had decided to quit her job in the city, and she moved to the country. She built a cabin, a 100-square-foot cabin, in the middle of nowhere in the forest. And I'm reading this article about how she gave up the hustle and bustle of a 9-to-5 job to live in the forest. And she said, well, you know, my biggest expense right now is Starlink internet, $160. And I said, my goodness, here's that name again, Starlink, in another news story. Now, we've seen Starlink showing up pretty much everywhere. Stories about Telesat, the Canadian satellite company. They're going to be getting a lot of government funding. And there's been some backlash to the government funding saying, hey, just give half the money to Starlink. They could do the job just as well. And of course, with the devastation south of the border, right, in Georgia, North Carolina, after they had a big hurricane, the name Starlink has been coming up as it's been a lifesaver for many emergency services. So let's take a look at Starlink and if it's becoming too dominant with Eric Berger, senior space editor at Ars Technica. Eric, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Elias. Good to talk to you.
And of course, part of this is when you blanket the sky with satellite after satellite after satellite, there's some other issues that come about. Light pollution, radio disruptions, and other types of chaos. What's your take here, Eric, on just how dominant Starlink has become?
Well, there are a lot of dimensions to this story, but, you know, in terms of dominance, they are the only player really of scope in low Earth orbit right now offering broadband internet. Now, you know, for 20 years or longer, there's been internet from space, but it's been from satellites, 30,000 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. So you get lag and latency when you're communicating with those satellites. The difference here is you've got satellites in low Earth orbit. And so you get a high bandwidth, low latency internet. And there's one other competitor, OneWeb, that has a couple hundred satellites, but they're not really selling service to consumers, and they're not global like SpaceX is with Starlink. So they are totally dominant right now in that communications environment.
What do you think explains how Starlink has been able to run the table in this space and become so dominant that there hasn't been another player? And I mentioned the Canadian company Telesat. They seem to be fledgling, relying on a government investment in recent weeks. How did it even happen that no one else tried to become a player in the way that Starlink did?
Well, other companies had tried and conceived of mega constellations in low Earth orbit before. There had been some pretty famous bankruptcies from companies who had tried this. It's essentially a $5 billion or $10 billion upfront cost to build satellites and make sure they all talk to one another successfully and get them into orbit. And so SpaceX, was really the first company to take this on and be successful at it. And one of the big helps was the fact that they're the only company in the world that has a reusable rocket, the Falcon 9, so they can afford to get their satellites up at a low cost compared to all of their competitors. But the biggest reason that they really have been successful, I think, is that they went all in on this. Elon Musk made a bold bet about 10 years ago, and they went for it, and they made the significant internal investments in this. No government was paying them for this service. And they went for it, and they've been successful.
What do you make of the complaints on the light pollution and the radio interference, that kind of thing? What do you make of those complaints, and is there any way of mitigating those types of complaints?
I have an astronomy degree, so I'm sympathetic to complaints from astronomers and Native Americans and other people who have serious concerns about changes in the night sky. SpaceX has tried to make some changes to the brightness of their satellites. They've listened to the community, but there's only so much you can do when you've got 7,000 satellites in space. And, this is just kind of the front end of the wave. You've got Amazon's Project Kuiper. You've got a mega constellation coming from China, at least one, if not two. Europe is talking about putting up several hundred satellites. Russia's got a 300-satellite constellation they want to build. And so, and you mentioned Telesat, there may be like 10,000 satellites in orbit now, but there could be 100,000, by the end of the decade or in the 2030s. And so this is, getting internet this way really is life-changing for some people, a lot of people even. And I think this is the future of basically ubiquitous internet. And unfortunately, that is going to change our relationship with the night sky.
And there's no going back, right? There's no turning back this ship.
I don't think there's any conceivable way to turn back the tide. I mean, it is good business for these companies to be there. They are providing an extremely valuable service. We had a hurricane here in Houston back in July, Beryl, and it knocked out power and internet to my house for about a week. And my wife was able to get a Starlink satellite, and I set it up that night, and we had broadband internet, within hours of the hurricane making landfall, and it was, coming down from space. And frankly, it felt pretty magical.
We're with Eric Berger, senior space editor at Ars Technica. Eric, has Starlink become too dominant? Other things I haven't mentioned, it seems like every airline in the world is either adopted or about to adopt Starlink for their internet. Cruise lines, right? All the boats, all the ships that have now adopted Starlink. Are they becoming too dominant? And if so, what do we do about it?
They have the first mover advantage. So there will be competitors that come into the market over the next 5 years. We're going to see the launch of the first operational Project Kuiper satellites. This is from Jeff Bezos' Amazon next year. And they're talking about having some basic service at the end of 2025. Is SpaceX too dominant? I mean, clearly China has it is raising serious geopolitical questions, right? China has seen the rise of Starlink and been extremely concerned. Russia has said these are valid targets of war because of the communication services they provided in Ukraine. And I think it's perhaps not, is Starlink too dominant? It's whether you want to trust Elon Musk with having control over this network that is so valuable, in not just in terms of business, but in terms of natural disasters like we've seen with Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, and also, the war situations in Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere, where he can turn off service if he wants to.
And the other thing that I get to is, well, how can someone compete if you're Starlink, you're owned by SpaceX, you're the company that is able to put stuff into orbit cheaper than anyone else? How will a competitor be able to compete on cost? It seems like it's almost impossible.
Well, the only way really is if you're Jeff Bezos and you have a personal fortune, and Amazon is a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate. It's a huge company. They can afford to eat losses in terms of being competitive. But if you're another competitor without a multi-billionaire backer, you either need a nation state behind you or you're probably not going to be successful.
Eric, listen, we have to leave it there. And of course, as you brought up, all the issues that come with Elon Musk and concerns that people have on him as well. Thanks for joining us this morning. Got to leave it there.
Okay, my pleasure. Take care.
Eric Berger is senior space editor at Ars Technica. Let me know, by the way, if you are relying on Starlink in your neck of the woods. How is it getting your internet via satellite?